The sun was a hammer, and the desert was the anvil. It beat down on the iron roof of the train car, the heat shimmering in waves so thick you could almost see them, blurring the endless expanse of cracked earth and skeletal saguaros into a quivering mirage. Inside, the air was a stew of coal smoke, sweat, and the fine, gritty dust that seeped through every crack in the groaning wooden walls. The rhythm of the journey was a brutal catechism, the clack-clack, clack-clack of steel wheels on steel rails, a sound that drilled into your skull and promised no destination, only more of the same. The door to the last car slid open with a shriek of tortured metal, letting in a blinding slice of the afternoon glare. A figure stumbled through, hesitating for a moment as her eyes struggled to adjust to the dim, suffocating interior. It was a girl, though the exhaustion etched on her face made her age hard to place. She could have been 16 or 26. The desert didn't care for such distinctions. Her dress, a faded calico that might have once been blue, was limp with sweat and streaked with grime, the hem caked with the reddish-brown mud of some distant, forgotten place. On her feet were a man's boots, scuffed and far too large, which slapped against the floorboards with a hollow, clumsy sound as she took a tentative step forward. She clutched a cloth sack to her chest, her knuckles white. It wasn't a large bag, but the way she held it pressed against her ribs like a shield suggested it contained the entire weight of her world. Her gaze darted around the car, frantic and yet trying desperately not to appear so. This was not a passenger car in the proper sense. It was a place for things and people who didn't quite belong elsewhere. A few rough-looking men, prospectors or ranch hands by their worn clothes, were slouched on hard wooden benches, their eyes glazed over with heat and boredom. One was snoring, his mouth agape, a fly buzzing lazily around his unshaven chin. Another was idly sharpening a knife, the soft schlick, schlick of stone on steel, a small, menacing sound in the rhythmic chaos of the train. They glanced at her, their looks ranging from disinterest to a brief, predatory flicker, before dismissing her as just another piece of driftwood on the current of westward expansion. Her eyes, wide and the color of a stormy sky, passed over them all and settled on the man in the far corner. He sat alone, a bulwark of stillness in the swaying car. He was a big man, not in a fleshy, soft way, but in the dense, hard-packed manner of an old oak. His shoulders were broad enough to block the grimy window behind him, and he occupied his space with a quiet finality that seemed to bend the very air around him. He wore a heavy canvas duster, the color of the dust outside, stained dark with weather and time. It fell open slightly, revealing a simple chambray shirt and leather vest, a low-brimmed hat, its felt softened and shaped by years of sun and rain, was pulled down, casting his face in deep shadow. Only his jaw was clearly visible, square and set, covered in a dark stubble that spoke of days on the trail. He wasn't looking out the window at the passing desolation. He was watching the car's interior in the faint reflection on the glass, a habit of a man who never liked surprises at his back. His hands rested on his knees, and they were the hands of a man who worked. Large, calloused, with scars mapping the knuckles and a stillness that suggested they were capable of both immense gentleness and terrible, swift violence. He was everything the other men were not. Where they were restless and loud in their stillness, he was utterly, unnervingly silent. He seemed less a passenger on the train and more a piece of the landscape it was passing through, as rugged, as quiet, and as unforgiving. His name was Will Calder, though no one on that train knew it, and he would not have offered it if they had. Words, to Will, were tools to be used sparingly, like the last cup of water in a canteen. He had spent years in the army, learning how little words mattered in the face of a bullet, and the years since as a cowboy, learning they mattered even less in the face of a blizzard or a stampede. Silence was his language now. It was his shield and, when needed, his weapon. The girl, Etta, took a deep, shuddering breath that was more a gasp for courage than for air. She took another clumsy step in the oversized boots, then another, The men who had noticed her before had already lost interest, turning back to their own miserable thoughts. The car swayed violently as it hit a rough patch of track, and she stumbled, catching herself on the edge of a bench. Her sack slipped, and she fumbled to secure it, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked back at the door she'd come through as if expecting it to burst open. Nothing, but the fear in her eyes said that nothing was only a temporary state. She fixed her gaze back on the silent man in the corner. He was her last chance. Her only chance. He hadn't moved a muscle, but she knew he was aware of her. She felt his attention like a physical touch, a steady, assessing pressure. It wasn't like the leering looks of the others. It was something different, something colder and more profound. It was the look of a man who saw not a girl, but a situation, a problem. She forced her feet to move, one slapping down in front of the other, the sound unnaturally loud in her own ears. She stopped a few feet from him, standing in the aisle, a waifish figure silhouetted against the dusty light. Her shadow stretched out before her, thin and trembling, falling across his boots. For a long moment, she just stood there, her throat working but no sound coming out. The words were trapped behind a wall of fear. He did not look up. He did not acknowledge her. He continued to watch her reflection in the glass, his face an unreadable mask of shadow and stone. The train rattled on, each clack of the wheels a tick of a clock that was running out. Finally, a whisper escaped her lips, so faint it was nearly lost in the noise of the train. "Mr." Will Calder's head tilted, a barely perceptible movement. His gaze shifted from the reflection to her, and for the first time, she saw his eyes beneath the brim of his hat. They were a pale, clear gray, the color of a winter sky, and held a weariness that went bone deep. There was no warmth in them, but there was no malice either. There was only a profound, hollow stillness, as if he had seen everything the world had to offer and had been impressed by none of it. "Please," she whispered again, taking a half-step closer. Her hands tightened on her sack. They're looking for me." She didn't say who they were. In this part of the country, it didn't matter. Trouble was trouble, and it wore many faces. Can I hide?" Her voice broke on the last word, and a single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She wasn't just asking for a place to conceal herself. She was begging for sanctuary, a concept that had no currency in the desolate lands between one hard-scrabbled town and the next. She was asking a complete stranger to take on her trouble as his own, a fool's request in a world where a man was lucky if he could carry the weight of his own past. Will's expression did not change. His gaze dropped from her face to her hands, which were trembling so violently that the cloth sack shook with them. He watched the tremor for a long, silent moment. He saw the desperation in that uncontrollable shaking, the raw, animal terror of the hunted. He had seen that same look in the eyes of young soldiers before a charge, and in the eyes of a cornered coyote. It was the look of something that knew its life was measured in seconds. His eyes rose again to meet hers. He had 1,000 reasons to say no, to turn away, to tell her to go bother someone else. Taking on a girl's trouble was a good way to get a knife in the ribs or a bullet in the back. He had sought solitude for a reason, to leave the world of men and their endless, bloody squabbles behind. He had nothing to gain from this. But he also saw the dirt-caked hem of her dress, the ill-fitting man's boots, and the raw fear that was so potent it was almost a smell in the air. He saw a creature that had been run to the very end of its rope, and in the deepest, most buried part of himself, the part he thought had died in a field in Shiloh. Something stirred, not pity. Pity was a useless emotion. It was something closer to recognition. He did not speak. He did not nod. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his left arm, pulling back the heavy canvas duster. The movement was economical, precise. He created an opening, a dark, narrow space between his body and the wall of the train. It was not an invitation. It was a statement of fact. Here is a space. It is empty. Do with it what you will. Etta stared at the opening for a heartbeat, her mind struggling to comprehend the silent offer. It was more than she had dared to hope for, and yet it was offered with such a lack of sentiment that it was almost frightening. There was no reassurance, no kindness. There was only the gesture. She didn't need any more. She scrambled forward, her oversized boots tripping her up. She dropped to her knees and crawled into the space he had made, huddling into the corner with her back pressed against the vibrating wall. Will let the duster fall back into place, the heavy fabric shrouding her completely. The world disappeared. The blinding desert light was gone, replaced by an encompassing darkness. The roar of the train was muffled, a distant, rhythmic rumble. The suffocating air of the car was replaced by the scent of him leather, trail dust, wood smoke, and the clean, cold smell of the night air that clung to the canvas. It was a masculine, elemental smell, the smell of solitude and survival. She pressed herself as small as she could, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around her sack. She could feel the solid warmth of his body against her shoulder, a steady, unyielding presence. Through the fabric of his shirt and her own thin dress, she could feel the slow, methodical beat of his heart. Thump, 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 thump. It was a rhythm as steady and relentless as the train's wheels, a counterpoint to the frantic, panicked drumming of her own heart. She was hidden. She was invisible. Under the coat of a silent stranger, she had ceased to exist. For the first time in days. She wasn't running. She was simply still. The darkness was no longer a thing to be feared, but a sanctuary. The heavy weight of his coat was not a prison, but a fortress, a temporary shield against a world that offered no quarter. She didn't know the man's name, and she didn't know if he would protect her for another 10 seconds or for the rest of the journey. But in that moment, pressed into the darkness, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Etta allowed herself one single, ragged breath of relief. She was safe, for now. Time inside the darkness of the coat was a strange, fluid thing. It stretched and compressed, measured not by the passing sun, but by the steady, metronomic beat of Will Calder's heart against her back. Etta had closed her eyes, trying to make herself smaller, to dissolve into the shadows. The constant, jarring rhythm of the train was a lullaby of sorts, a promise of movement, of distance being put between her and whatever lay behind. For a few minutes that felt like an eternity. A fragile sense of peace began to settle in her bones. The terror that had been a rigid knot in her stomach started to loosen its grip, ever so slightly. Then the rhythm changed. The relentless clack-clack of the wheels began to slow, the pitch dropping into a long, mournful groan. A loud hiss of steam erupted from somewhere up ahead, and the entire car shuddered as the brakes engaged. Etta's eyes snapped open in the darkness. Her brief calm evaporated like a drop of water on a hot skillet, replaced by a cold, sharp dread. A stop. A stop meant people could get on. Will Calder's body tensed. It was a subtle shift, a hardening of the muscles in his back that she felt through her thin dress. His heartbeat did not quicken. It remained as slow and steady as a deep river current. But the river was no longer calm. It was now a river of ice. He knew what a stop in the middle of nowhere meant. It meant trouble. The train ground to a final, jarring halt. The sudden silence was more deafening than the noise had been. Etta could hear everything now, the nervous cough of the prospector across the aisle, the buzz of a fly against the window pane, the frantic, shallow sound of her own breathing. She held her breath, listening. Heavy boots crunched on the gravel outside, not the shuffling steps of a tired passenger, but the deliberate, heavy treads of men with a purpose. A low murmur of voices. Then a coarse laugh that scraped against the silence like a rusty nail. The sound was too confident, too proprietary. It was the sound of men who believed the world belonged to them. The door to their car slid open with a painful screech. This time, it wasn't a girl fleeing the light. but 3 figures silhouetted against the blinding white of the desert sun. They stepped inside, letting the door slam shut behind them, plunging the car back into its dim, dusty state. They stood there for a moment, their eyes adjusting, their presence sucking the very air from the small space. Etta couldn't see them, not clearly, but she could feel them. She could smell the stale whiskey and sweat that rolled off them in a wave. She could hear the creak of their leather gun belts. Will shifted his weight ever so slightly, a minute adjustment that closed the final seam of his duster, sealing her in complete blackness. He was a wall of stone, and she was a fossil trapped within it. "Afternoon," a voice drawled, slick with a false congeniality that did nothing to hide its menacing edge. "Just making a quick pass-through. Don't mind us." Etta pictured the man who owned the voice. He would be smiling, but the smile wouldn't reach his eyes. He was the leader. "We're looking for something," the voice continued, closer now. The sound of boots on the wooden floorboards approached, slow and deliberate. A predator's pace. "Belongs to a business associate of ours down in Red Creek. A piece of property. Small thing. Kinda pretty. Answers to the name of Etta. You folks seen anything like that?" The silence in the car was thick and suffocating. No one answered. The prospector's coughing stopped. Even the fly seemed to have ceased its buzzing. "No, well, property like that. It gets scared. Likes to hide in dark corners." The footsteps came closer. Etta could feel the vibration through the floor. Will remained utterly still. His breathing was a slow, silent tide, in and out, a force of nature that could not be hurried. There was a grunt, and the sound of a man being roughly jostled. "What's in the bag, old-timer?" the voice demanded. Nothing," a quavering voice replied. "Just tools. My claim." "Ain't interested in your claim," the leader snapped. A moment later, there was the sound of something heavy hitting the floor, followed by the metallic clatter of prospecting tools. "See, just tools. We're all friends here." The footsteps resumed their slow, methodical journey down the aisle. 2 sets, maybe 3. They were checking every shadow, every space. Etta pressed her face into the rough canvas of Will's duster, trying to stop the trembling that had started in her legs. She bit her lips so hard she tasted blood. Anything to keep from making a sound. Her world had shrunk to this dark, smelling space, to the solidness of the man beside her and the terror of the footsteps outside. They were getting closer, so close now that she could hear the jingle of spurs, the soft creak of leather. The shadow of a man fell over them. The dim light filtering through the coat fabric dimmed even further. "Well now," the oily voice said, right beside them. "Look what we have here. A man wearing a winter coat in a furnace. That ain't peculiar at all." A second man chuckled, a low, brutish sound. "Maybe he's cold. Silas." "Maybe he is. Jeb," the leader, Silas, replied. His voice was conversational, but it was coiled like a snake. "Or maybe he's hiding something. People who hide things make me curious. What you got under there, friend? A sack of gold? A stolen horse? Or maybe a runaway girl?" Will Calder did not reply. He did not turn. He did not even seem to breathe. The only thing he did was lean forward, a fractional movement of his torso. It was barely perceptible, but to Etta, huddled against him, it felt like the shifting of a mountain. The motion pulled the duster tighter around her, pressing the fabric against her cheek, erasing the last sliver of the outside world. It was a silent, definitive answer. "This space is mine. What is in it is mine. Keep walking." There was a long, charged pause. Etta could feel the tension outside the coat, a palpable thing, thick and heavy like storm clouds gathering. She could imagine the scene perfectly, the 2 men, Silas and Jeb, looming over the seated, silent figure of Will. A third man, younger from the sound of his nervous shuffling, hung back. "He ain't talking. Silas," Jeb grunted, his voice impatient. "I can see that," Silas hissed, his false pleasantness gone, replaced by a raw, angry edge. "I asked you a question, Mr. I expect an answer. Now, you gonna show me what's under that coat? Or is my associate Jeb here gonna open it for you?" Still, Will was silent, but he moved again. His right hand, which had been resting on his knee, slid down slowly, deliberately, to his side. Etta couldn't see it, but she knew where it was going. To the worn leather holster strapped to his thigh. His fingers didn't touch the handle of the Colt resting there. They just hovered, a breath away, a silent promise of what would happen if they pushed any further. Silas must have seen it. There was another pause, longer this time. The air in the car crackled. Etta felt as if her lungs would burst from holding her breath. This was it, the moment it would all come apart in a crash of violence and noise. But it didn't. When Silas spoke again, his voice had a different tone. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a grudging, resentful respect. It was the tone of a predator that has sized up its prey and found it to be something else entirely, something it was not prepared to fight. "You know," Silas said, his voice a low sneer, "I look at you and I see a man who's had his fill of trouble, a man who wants to be left alone. I can respect that." He took a step back. The shadow shifted. "But you're on the wrong train, friend. This train's got our trouble on it. And we always collect." Will Calder finally moved his head. He lifted it slowly, and his pale gray eyes found Silas's from under the brim of his hat. Etta, sensing the shift, wrist peering through a tiny gap where the coat met his side. She saw Silas's face for the first time. He was a wiry man with a mean, narrow face and eyes like chips of brown glass. And in those eyes, she saw a flicker of something she hadn't expected: uncertainty. Will's gaze was as flat and cold as a frozen lake. It held no anger, no fear, no challenge. It was a look of pure, unadulterated finality. It was the look of a man who had already weighed the life of the man in front of him and found it wanting. It was a look that said, "You have no idea what trouble looks like. But if you stay here 1 second longer, you will." Silas held the gaze for a moment, his jaw tight. The facade of the confident hunter had cracked, revealing the nervous bully underneath. He broke first, his eyes flicking away. He scoffed, a pathetic attempt to regain his authority. "Have it your way," he spat. "Keep your damn secrets." He turned to his men. "Come on, she's probably in one of the other cars." Just as they turned to leave, a sound cut through the tense quiet, a high, terrified scream from outside the train. It was a woman's voice. Instantly, all 3 men spun toward the window, their attention diverted. "What the hell was that?" Jeb growled. "Sounds like Finn found her," Silas said, a cruel grin spreading across his face as he shoved his way toward the door. But Will Calder wasn't looking at the window. He was looking at the path their distraction had created. In that split second of chaos, his stillness shattered. He was pure, kinetic energy. His hand, which had been hovering over his gun, shot out and grabbed Etta's wrist. His grip was like iron, not painful, but absolute and unyielding. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He pulled. Etta stumbled out from under the coat, her legs stiff and clumsy. He yanked her to her feet and half dragged, half pushed her toward the rear of the car. The other passengers were blurs. The world was a dizzying smear of motion and noise. The boots of Silas's men were already pounding down the aisle toward the front exit, toward the source of the scream. They hadn't even noticed their prey had broken cover. They reached the back door, a heavy sliding panel that led to the small, railed platform at the very end of the train. Will didn't hesitate. He slammed his shoulder into it, forcing it open with a deafening groan. The world exploded in a roar of wind and clattering steel. The desert rushed past them in a blur of brown and gray. The wind tore at their clothes, stealing the breath from Etta's lungs. The train wasn't moving fast, having just left the stop. but it was fast enough. Will stepped out onto the tiny platform, pulling Etta with him. He looked down at the blur of gravel and earth rushing by beneath them. It looked 100 miles away. He looked back at her. His face was grim, his eyes intense. For the first time, he spoke to her, his voice a low shout over the roar. "When I pull, you jump." She stared at him, her eyes wide with terror, shaking her head. The jump was impossible. It was suicide. He didn't give her time to argue. He placed his hands on her waist, positioning her at the edge. "Now," he commanded. He released her and leaped. He didn't just fall. He launched himself away from the train, his big body surprisingly agile. He hit the ground, tucked his shoulder, and rolled, absorbing the impact in a cloud of dust and grit. He was on his feet in an instant, turning back to the train, his arms outstretched for her. Etta stood frozen at the edge, the wind whipping her hair across her face. Behind her, in the car, she heard a shout. They had been seen. The fear of the men behind her and the fear of the fall before her warred within her, paralyzing her. Will's eyes locked on hers. They were not pleading. They were commanding, "Live." He took a step toward the moving train as if he meant to run alongside it. He reached up. His hand closed around her wrist again, the same iron grip. He pulled. Her feet left the platform. For one terrifying, weightless second, she was flying. Then the ground came up to meet her with a brutal, punishing force. She landed badly, her ankle twisting under her. Pain, sharp and blinding, shot up her leg. She cried out as she tumbled across the sharp gravel, the impact knocking the wind from her. Sand and dust filled her mouth, her nose, her eyes. The world was a spinning, painful chaos. But as she lay there, gasping for breath, her body screaming in protest, she heard the sound of the train receding down the tracks, its rhythmic clatter fading into the distance. She pushed herself up on her elbows, spitting out a mouthful of grit. Her ankle throbbed with a fiery agony. Every inch of her body was scraped and bruised. The wind whipped at her, cold despite the sun's heat. She was alive. A cloud of dust swirled around her. Will Calder was already there, kneeling beside her, his hand on her shoulder. A silent, solid presence in the vast, howling emptiness of the desert. The freedom was a raw, aching pain, but it was freedom nonetheless, and she was breathing it. The world came back into focus slowly, one painful sensation at a time. First, the sharp-edged gravel digging into her cheek. Second, the raw, burning scrapes on her arms and hands. Third, the thrumming, incandescent pain in her left ankle, a fire that consumed her from the foot up. And last, the silence, a profound, ringing silence that was nothing like the quiet inside the duster. This was the silence of emptiness, the sound of a world without people, without shelter, without anything but wind and rock. The train was gone, a ghost of smoke on the horizon, its fading clatter already swallowed by the immense landscape. A shadow fell over her. Etta flinched, her body tensing for another blow, another fight, but it was only him. Will Calder knelt beside her, his large frame blocking the brutal sun. His face, now fully visible in the harsh light, was a roadmap of hard miles and sun-weathered patience. Deep lines bracketed his mouth and fanned from the corners of his pale gray eyes. He looked at her not with pity, but with the practical, assessing gaze of a rancher examining a lame horse. Without a word, his hands, surprisingly gentle for their size and calloused texture, went to her injured ankle. He probed the swelling flesh with a focused efficiency that was both unnerving and calming. Etta sucked in a sharp breath as a jolt of pain shot up her leg, but she didn't pull away. His touch was impersonal, clinical. He was not comforting her. He was diagnosing a problem. After a moment, he seemed to come to a conclusion. He released her ankle and reached into a leather pouch on his belt, pulling out a roll of clean, narrow cloth. He wrapped her ankle swiftly and expertly, the binding tight enough to offer support but not so tight as to cut off the blood. The simple, practical act was more reassuring than any empty words could have been. He finished his work and looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he looked out across the shimmering heat waves of the desert. A vast and hostile sea they were now stranded in. He rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion. He expected her to do the same. Etta struggled, pushing herself up with scraped palms. She got to one knee, then tried to put weight on her good foot. The world tilted violently. The pain in her ankle was a white-hot scream. She bit back a cry, her vision swimming with black spots. She was not going to be able to walk. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was a liability, a dead weight. Here, in this place, a thing that could not move was a thing that would die. Will watched her struggle for a moment, his face impassive. He saw the desperation and the dawning despair in her eyes. He had made a choice on the train, a choice to intervene. The consequences of that choice were now standing, or rather, failing to stand before him. He turned his back to her and crouched down. It was not an offer. It was a command. She stared at his broad, solid back, confused for a second. Then she understood. Humiliation warred with the primal instinct for survival. Survival won, awkwardly, painfully. She crawled the short distance and allowed him to maneuver her onto his back. He grunted softly as he took her weight, then stood up as if she were little more than a full grain sack. He adjusted her position, then began to walk, his stride long, even and relentlessly steady. Etta clung to him, her face pressed against the rough fabric of his duster. The world became a rhythmic, swaying journey. The smell of him was the same dust, leather, and something uniquely his own, like clean earth and cold stone. She could feel the power in his legs, the steady, tireless movement of his muscles. He walked without seeming to notice the heat or the punishing terrain, his eyes fixed on some distant, invisible point on the horizon. They walked for what felt like hours. The sun beat down on them, and the landscape offered no comfort. It was a world of rock and thorn, of lizards skittering for cover and vultures circling high in the bleached blue sky. Etta's initial fear of the men on the train was slowly being replaced by a more fundamental terror, the fear of the land itself. It was indifferent to her suffering, indifferent to her life. Without this silent man, she would be bones picked clean by coyotes within a day. The thought sent a shudder through her. Just when she thought she could not endure the heat or the jarring rhythm for another minute, the landscape began to change. Will led them down a subtle decline, a dry wash that gradually deepened into a shallow canyon. The bare rock began to give way to pockets of soil. A few hardy junipers appeared, their twisted forms offering pathetic patches of shade. The air grew cooler, the silence less oppressive. It was as if they were descending into a different, hidden world. He rounded a large rock outcropping, and suddenly, it was there, tucked into a curve of the canyon wall, sheltered by a small grove of cottonwood trees whose leaves whispered in the faint breeze, was a cabin. It was small and rough, built of logs that were dark with age and weather, chinked with mud and stone. A thin plume of smoke curled from a stone chimney, a fragile gray ribbon against the stark blue sky. Beside it was a small, fenced-in garden where a few hardy lines of vegetables grew, and a hand pump stood over a well. It wasn't a home built to be seen. It was a den, a sanctuary, built to be hidden. As they approached, a small figure emerged from behind the cabin. It was a boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with a shock of unruly brown hair, and feet as brown and bare as the earth. He wore a man's shirt that hung on him like a sackcloth, belted with a piece of rope. He was carrying a wooden bucket, but he stopped dead when he saw them, his eyes as wide and watchful as a deer's fixed on Etta. Will didn't break his stride. He walked directly toward the boy. When he was a few feet away, he stopped and gave the boy a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The boy's gaze shifted from Etta to Will. and a silent understanding passed between them. He gave a nod in return. His young face as serious and solemn as Will's. He asked no questions. He showed no surprise. He simply accepted her presence as a new fact of his world. Then he turned and disappeared inside the cabin. The boy's name was Huck, and this quiet hollow was the only home he had ever known. Will carried Etta over the threshold. The air inside was cool and smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something savory, like stewed rabbit. The interior was a single, spare room, but it was meticulously clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. Its hearth swept clean. A rough-hewn table and 2 stools stood in the center of the room. 2 bunks were built into the far wall, their mattresses stuffed with straw and covered with clean wool blankets. A few shelves held tin plates, a handful of books, and an assortment of objects: a bird's nest, a strangely shaped river stone, a hawk's feather, the small treasures of a boy. It was a place of profound and deliberate simplicity. Will walked to the fireplace and gently set her down in a sturdy wooden chair that sat beside the cold hearth. Her feet touched the smooth, cool flagstones, and a wave of relief so intense it bordered on pain washed over her. She was down. She was inside. She was safe. The boy, Huck, reappeared at her side. He held out a tin cup filled with water. His movements were silent and careful. Etta looked from the boy to Will, who stood watching her. His hat now in his hands, he gave her another nod, this one directed at the cup. Her hands trembled as she took it. The water was cold and clean, and she drank it down in greedy gulps, the simple act feeling like a sacrament. When the cup was empty, Huck took it from her and refilled it from the bucket without being asked. Will's gaze then moved from her to one of the empty bunks, and then back to her face. He gave a third and final nod. That was all. There were no words of welcome, no promises of protection, no questions about the trouble that had followed her. There was only this: a place by the fire, a cup of water, and a silent acknowledgement that she could stay. It was more than anyone had given her in her entire life. The weight of it, the sheer, unadorned decency of the gesture, broke something inside her. She bowed her head, and tears she didn't know she had left to cry fell silently onto her lap. She must have slept. An exhausted, dreamless sleep slumped in the chair. When she awoke, the harsh afternoon light had softened to the golden glow of late evening. A fire now crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering light around the room. The smell of a simple bean and bacon stew filled the air. Huck sat on the floor by the fire, meticulously whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. Will was at the table, his back to her, cleaning a rifle. The soft, metallic clicks of his work a peaceful, domestic sound. A deep, instinctual need rose up in Etta. She could not be a passenger here. She could not simply take. Her life had taught her that nothing was free, and that safety was earned, not given. More than that, she needed to do something, to anchor herself to this new, fragile reality with the weight of physical work, to move, to act, to create a small piece of order in the chaos of her mind. Wincing at the pain in her ankle, she carefully got to her feet, using the chair for support. Neither Will nor Huck looked up, but she knew they were aware of her every movement. She found a crude but effective broom leaning in a corner and began to sweep the floorboards. The soft shush-shush of the bristles was a comforting sound. It was the sound of a home. She worked slowly, carefully, her movements deliberate, pouring all her focus into the simple, repetitive task. She swept the dust and the dirt of the trail into a neat pile and scooped it into the fire. Next, her eyes fell on the meager pile of kindling and chopped wood beside the hearth. She knelt, her ankle protesting, and began to stack it, sorting the smaller pieces for kindling from the larger logs for burning. The rough bark felt solid and real in her hands. Each piece she placed was a brick in a new wall she was building around herself. Finally, she turned her attention to the stew simmering over the fire. using a wooden spoon she found on the mantel. She stirred it. It was a simple, rustic meal, but the smell was honest and nourishing. She found the tin plates on the shelf and set them on the table. One for Will, one for Huck, and, after a moment's hesitation, one for herself. When she was done, she returned to the chair by the fire, her body aching but her mind strangely calm. The work had quieted the frantic buzzing in her head. It had given her a purpose, however small. Will finished cleaning his rifle and assembled it with practiced ease. He stood, walked to the fire, and ladled the stew into the 3 plates she had set out. He handed one to Huck, then brought one to her. He set it on a small stool beside her chair. Then he sat at the table to eat his own. Huck joined him, and the 2 of them ate in their customary silence. No one spoke. No one said thank you. No one commented on the tasks she had performed. Her work was simply accepted, absorbed into the quiet rhythm of the cabin, just as she had been. They ate as the firelight danced on the log walls, 3 silent figures sharing a meal. The ghosts of her past were still out there, somewhere in the vast darkness of the desert. But for the first time, Etta felt the faint, flickering warmth of a hearth, a fragile and unspoken promise that she was no longer facing them alone. The days settled into a rhythm, as stark and predictable as the rising and setting of the desert sun. Will would be gone before the first light touched the canyon rim, a silent ghost slipping out into the pre-dawn chill. He would return at dusk, smelling of dust and horse, carrying a rabbit or a pair of quail for the pot. In the long hours between his departure and return, the cabin and the small patch of cultivated earth around it became Etta's world, a world she shared with the quiet, watchful boy, Huck. Her ankle healed slowly. At first, she limped heavily, her tasks confined to the cabin's interior, but as the swelling subsided and the pain dulled to a persistent ache, her circle widened. She began tending the small garden, her fingers learning the feel of the dry, crumbly soil. She pulled the stubborn weeds that fought for every drop of water, her movements slow and deliberate. She learned the particular groan of the pump handle and the clean, metallic taste of the water it drew from deep within the earth. Huck was her silent companion in these chores. He never spoke unless a direct question required a one-word answer, but he was always there, anticipating her needs. If he saw her struggling with the water bucket, he would appear at her side and take it from her, his small frame straining with the effort. If she was mending a tear in one of Will's shirts by the fading light, he would place the oil lamp on the table beside her without being asked. They existed in a world woven from the threads of silence. It was a silence unlike any Etta had ever known. It wasn't the menacing silence of the saloon owner's study, thick with unspoken threats. It wasn't the empty, lonely silence of the nights she had spent hiding in barns and ditches. This silence was different. It was foundational. It was the bedrock of the canyon, the space between the rustling cottonwood leaves, the canvas on which the small sounds of their lives were painted, the crackle of the fire, the scrape of a spoon against a tin plate, the steady thump, thump, thump of Will chopping wood. In this quiet, Etta began to feel a strange unfolding within herself. The hard, tight knot of fear that had been her constant companion for as long as she could remember was still there. But it no longer felt like a fist clenched around her heart. It was beginning to soften, to loosen its grip. She found herself watching Will as he worked in the evenings, his movements economical and precise. She watched the way his large, scarred hands could be so surprisingly deft as he repaired a piece of tack or sharpened a knife. She watched the way his eyes would scan the canyon walls, a constant, instinctual vigilance that was as much a part of him as breathing. He was a man who lived on the edge of the world, and he had made his peace with it. He asked for nothing, and he expected nothing. His stillness was not emptiness. It was a deep, settled strength. The past, however, was a patient ghost. It did not need noise or chaos to make its presence felt. It could rise up in the quietest of moments. It happened one evening, a few weeks after her arrival. The air had a cool edge to it, a hint of the coming autumn. Huck was already asleep in his bunk, his breathing a soft, rhythmic whisper. Will sat at the table, mending a bridle by the light of the lamp, his head bent over his work. Etta sat in her usual chair by the hearth, darning one of her own thin stockings, the only other pair she owned. Her fingers worked automatically, the needle dipping in and out of the worn fabric. Her thumb brushed against the ring on her finger. It was a cheap, flimsy thing, made of brass that was now worn and discolored. She had almost forgotten it was there. It had become a part of her, like a scar. The firelight caught its dull surface, and in that faint gleam, the wall she had so carefully built around her memories crumbled to dust. She saw not the warm, safe light of the cabin, but the greasy, yellow light of a saloon lamp. She smelled not wood smoke, but stale beer and unwashed bodies. She heard not the gentle whisper of the wind in the chimney, but the raucous laughter of drunken men and the tinny, out-of-tune notes of a piano. Her hands stopped moving. The needle fell from her numb fingers and clattered onto the stone hearth. The small sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Will's hands paused in their work. He did not look up immediately. He simply became still, listening. He had heard more than the sound of a dropped needle. He had heard the sound of a memory breaking the surface. He waited. Etta stared into the fire, her eyes seeing flames that had burned long ago. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, raspy whisper, the voice of a stranger. "My father," she began, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "He was a farmer, not a good one. He had a thirst for whiskey and a talent for bad luck. The land was poor, and the sky never gave enough rain." She paused, swallowing hard. Will slowly lifted his head, his pale eyes watching her. He did not prompt her to continue. He simply watched, his face a mask of shadow and quiet attention. "He owed money," she said, her voice growing stronger, flatter, as if she were reciting a story she had memorized long ago. "He owed it to a man named Jedediah Croft, a man who owned the saloon and half the town besides, a man who collected his debts one way or another." She lifted her left hand, the firelight glinting on the cheap brass ring. "One night, my father came home. He'd been drinking. He didn't look at me. He just told me to put on my best dress. We walked to the saloon. It was late. The place was full of noise and smoke." She shivered, despite the warmth of the fire. "He took me to the back room. Jedediah was there, sitting behind a big desk. He was a large man, soft. He smelled of sweat and sweet cigars." Her gaze was fixed on the flames, but her mind was in that small, suffocating room. "My father couldn't look at him either. He just stared at the floor. They talked about accounts, about interest, about a final payment. I didn't understand all the words, but I understood the silence when they stopped talking and both looked at me." Jedediah smiled. He had small, wet eyes. "He said I was a fine-looking girl, said I'd be a good worker." He pushed a stack of coins across the desk. "My father took the money. He counted it. Then he turned and walked out of the room. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't look back." The flat, emotionless tone she had maintained finally cracked. A single tear escaped and traced a slow path down her cheek. She didn't seem to notice it. "I was part of the bargain," she whispered. "His debt was paid." She fell silent. The only sounds in the room were the crackling of the fire and the soft sigh of the wind outside. She had told him the worst of it, the part that had branded her soul, the fact of being a thing, an object, a coin used to settle a ledger. She finally looked away from the fire and at the ring on her finger. "This," she said, her voice thick with self-loathing. "I stole the money for it? A few pennies at a time from the saloon's till. I bought it from a traveling peddler. I thought if men saw it, they would think I belonged to someone, that they would leave me be. It was a lie, a stupid, childish lie. It didn't stop anything." She closed her eyes, and the tears came freely now. silent and hot. She did not sob or make a sound. She just wept, her shoulders shaking with the weight of all the unshed tears she had carried for so long. She had never told anyone. To speak of it was to make it real again. But in the profound, non-judgmental silence of this cabin, the truth had finally found its way out. Will had not moved. He had listened to her entire story without a single change in his expression. His gaze had not wavered from her face. He did not see a sullied girl or a victim. He saw a soldier telling a war story. He saw the scars of a battle she had fought alone. He recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same look he saw in his own reflection sometimes. The look of someone who has seen the world for what it is and is no longer surprised by its capacity for cruelty. He did not offer words of comfort. Words were cheap. Words like "I'm sorry" or "it'll be all right" were lies. He knew it, and he knew she knew it too. Pity was an insult to a survivor. Slowly, he pushed his chair back and stood up. Etta flinched, thinking he was going to walk away, to leave her alone with the ugliness she had just laid bare. Instead, he walked to a shelf near the door, took a small, clean piece of cotton cloth from a stack there, and walked back to her. He did not touch her. He did not try to comfort her. He simply held the cloth out to her. It was a gesture of such profound and simple practicality that it cut through her grief like a sharp, clean knife. He wasn't recoiling from her story. He wasn't judging her. He was offering a solution to the immediate problem, her tears. She looked at the cloth in his hand, then up at his face. In his eyes, she saw no pity, no disgust. She saw only a deep, quiet understanding. It was an acknowledgement of her pain that was more powerful than any words could ever be. She took the cloth. Her trembling fingers brushed against his, and the brief contact was like an anchor in a storm. She wiped her eyes and blew her nose. She folded the cloth neatly and held it in her lap. The storm had passed. Will returned to his chair at the table and picked up the bridle he had been mending. He resumed his work as if nothing had happened, but everything had happened. A truth had been spoken into the silence, and the silence had held it. It had not shattered. It had simply expanded to make room for it. The quiet in the cabin was different now. Before, it had been the silence of two strangers sharing a space. Now, it was a silence built on a shared knowledge, a shared understanding of the harshness of the world. It was no longer a void between them, but a bridge. Etta sat by the fire for a long time. The folded cloth clutched in her hand. She watched the steady, competent movement of Will's hands. She listened to the peaceful sounds of the cabin. The fear was still a part of her story, but it was no longer the only part. In telling him, she had not given him her burden to carry, but had simply set it down in the space between them, and he had not turned away. The silence was no longer frightening. It was a comfort. It was a blanket. In a world that had tried to tear her apart, this quiet man and his quiet cabin had become the place where, piece by piece, she could begin to put herself back together. The confession, once spoken, did not linger in the air like a foul smoke. It was absorbed into the thick log walls and the stone hearth, becoming just another story in a land that was full of them. In its place, a new kind of quiet settled in the cabin, lighter and more breathable than before. The silence was no longer a void Etta felt the need to fill or a tension she had to endure. It was a shared territory, a common ground on which she, Will, and Huck could exist without the clumsy artifice of words. The rhythm of their days continued unchanged, but the feeling beneath it had shifted. The fragile truce between strangers was slowly, imperceptibly, giving way to the comfortable quiet of a family. Etta found herself venturing farther from the cabin's immediate orbit. Her ankle, now a dull memory of pain, allowed her a new freedom. She began exploring the nooks and crannies of the small canyon. Her senses, once dulled by fear, now sharpened to the world around her. She learned the scent of sun-baked rock and the cool, damp smell of the earth near the cottonwoods. She learned to identify the tracks of deer and rabbits in the soft dust of the canyon floor. She was no longer just hiding in the hollow. She was beginning to inhabit it. It was on one of these small expeditions, while searching for the bitter roots her grandmother had once taught her to use for tea, that she saw it, tucked into a fissure in a large sandstone boulder, a place that seemed to offer just enough soil and shade for life to take hold, was a single, defiant splash of color. It was a wildflower, a desert marigold. Its petals were a brilliant, fiery orange, a small, brave flag of beauty raised against the overwhelming brown and gray of the landscape. It was not a grand or delicate flower. It was sturdy, resilient, its stem thick and its leaves a dusty green. It was a survivor. She stood looking at it for a long time. It seemed a miracle that something so vibrant could exist in such a harsh place. It reminded her of the feeling that had begun to grow in her own chest, a small, tentative bloom of hope in the barren wasteland of her past. On impulse, she reached out and gently plucked it, the stem snapping with a faint, clean sound. She held it in her hand, its brilliant color a stark contrast to her own calloused, work-worn palm. She carried it back to the cabin, cupping it carefully to protect it from the breeze. All afternoon, as she went about her chores, she kept it in a cup of water on the windowsill, its bright face turned toward the light. It was just a flower, a simple, common weed, but to her, it felt like a treasure. It was a piece of beauty she had found for herself, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to share it. The words, "thank you," were lodged in her throat. They were too small for the debt she owed Will Calder, and at the same time, too large and frightening to speak aloud. How could she thank a man for her life? How could she thank him for listening to the ugliest parts of her soul and not turning away? The words were inadequate. They were clumsy tools for a delicate job. But the flower was different. It could speak for her. It could say everything she couldn't. "I see the beauty in this hard place. Thank you for showing it to me. Thank you for letting me live." That evening, after Huck had fallen asleep and the cabin was filled with the soft sounds of his breathing and the crackle of the fire, she waited. Will was outside, making his final checks of the night a routine as predictable as the stars that now glittered in the black sky above the canyon. Etta's heart hammered against her ribs. This felt more daring than any of her acts of survival, more risky than jumping from the train. This was an offering, a gesture of the heart, and she had no idea how it would be received. Her hands trembling slightly, she took the flower from its cup of water. She opened the heavy cabin door just a crack, the cool night air rushing in. The rough stone that served as a doorstep was washed in the pale, ethereal light of the moon. She knelt and placed the flower directly in the center of the stone, its orange petals a small pool of warmth in the cool darkness. Then she quickly retreated back inside, closing the door softly and bolting it. She went to her bunk and lay down, pulling the blanket up to her chin, her eyes wide open in the dark, listening. A few minutes later, she heard his footsteps approaching, the familiar, steady crunch of his boots on the gravel. The footsteps stopped at the door. There was a pause, a long, unnervingly silent pause. Etta held her breath. She imagined him standing there, looking down at the small, bright flower on the step. Was he confused, annoyed? Did he think it was childish? Did he just kick it aside and come in? The silence stretched on, each second a lifetime. Then she heard the soft scrape of the door latch. The door opened and closed. His boots crossed the floor to the hearth. He added a log to the fire, the way he always did. He moved to the table, and she heard the soft thud of his gun belt being placed upon it. Then, the creak of his bunk as he lay down. There was no other sound, no mention of the flower. Nothing. Etta lay in the darkness, a cold knot of disappointment and embarrassment tightening in her stomach. He had ignored it. The gesture had been meaningless. She turned her face to the wall, feeling foolish and small, and eventually fell into a troubled sleep. 2 days passed. The flower was not mentioned. Etta tried to put it out of her mind, to chalk it up to her own foolishness. She focused on her work, her movements a little more brisk, her silence a little more brittle than before. The comfortable quiet had been disturbed by her failed attempt to communicate, and a sliver of the old tension had returned. It was on the third day that it happened. Will had been called outside shortly after the midday meal to deal with a coyote that had been sniffing around the small enclosure where he kept his horse. In his haste, he had left a small, leather-bound notebook lying open on the table. Etta never touched his things. They were his, part of the private world he had occupied long before she had fallen into it. But as she moved to clear the plates from the table, Huck, chasing after a grasshopper that had found its way inside, stumbled and knocked the notebook to the floor. "Sorry," he mumbled, the word a rarity for him as he scrambled after his prize. "It's all right," Etta said, bending to pick it up. It had fallen open to a different page. Her intention was simply to close it and put it back where it belonged. But her eyes caught something, and she froze. There, lying flat between the pages, was her flower. It was pressed carefully, its petals flattened into a perfect, fiery star against the off-white paper. The pages around it were filled with Will's handwriting, not words, but small, detailed sketches, a drawing of a hawk in flight, a meticulously rendered diagram of a trigger mechanism, a sketch of the unique pattern of a mountain lion's track, and in the middle of all this rugged, practical observation, her desert marigold. He hadn't just taken it, he hadn't thrown it away. He had saved it, he had preserved it, he had placed it amongst the things that he considered important enough to record. Etta stared at the page, her heart doing a slow, painful somersault in her chest. A wave of warmth spread through her, so potent it made her feel dizzy. This was his answer. This was his thank you in return. He had understood her silent message and had sent one back in a language she was just beginning to learn. It was a language of quiet actions, of things kept, of value placed on the small and the fragile. She gently closed the book and placed it back on the table, exactly where it had been. When Will returned, she said nothing, but when she looked at him, she saw him differently. The unreadable mask was still there, but she had been given a glimpse of what lay behind it. That single preserved flower changed everything. It was a permission slip, an invitation to a new kind of conversation. The suspicion that had been the bedrock of her existence began to crumble, and in its place, a tentative trust began to grow. This trust was nurtured not with words, but with a series of small, silent gestures that began to weave themselves into the fabric of their daily lives. The next afternoon, when Will returned from a long ride, his face caked with dust and his shoulders slumped with fatigue, he found a tin cup of cool, fresh water from the well waiting for him on the table. He stopped, looked at the cup, then looked at Etta, who was busy kneading dough, her back to him. He didn't speak. He simply picked it up and drained it in one long swallow. It was a simple cup of water. It was also an acknowledgement. "I see your thirst. I see your weariness. Let me offer this small comfort." A few days later, Etta found a piece of soft, tanned deer hide, scraped and worked until it was as supple as cloth, draped over the hard wooden back of her chair by the fire. It hadn't been there that morning. Will was out, and Huck was down by the creek. There was no one to ask. It had simply appeared. It was a silent answer. "I see your need for comfort. Let me offer this small softness." She began to take more care in her mending of his and Huck's clothes, her stitches becoming finer, more intricate. He, in turn, began to leave things for her, a handful of sweet wild berries in a bowl, a bird's feather of an impossible, iridescent blue left on the windowsill. One morning, a small hatchet with a newly carved handle and a perfectly sharpened head was leaning against the wood pile, a tool perfectly sized for her hands. These were not gifts, not in the traditional sense. They were statements. They were the paragraphs and chapters of a story being written in a language of deeds. Each gesture was a quiet affirmation. You are seen. You are valued. You belong here. One evening, as the sun bled its final colors across the canyon rim, Etta stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching the two of them. Will was showing Huck how to tie a particular kind of knot, his large, scarred hands moving slowly and deliberately, guiding the boy's small, clumsy ones. Huck was watching with a rapt, silent concentration. The firelight from within the cabin cast their long shadows across the ground. Two figures, one large and one small, bound together in a moment of quiet instruction. A feeling washed over Etta, a feeling so foreign she struggled to identify it. It was a deep, quiet warmth that settled in her chest and radiated through her limbs. It was not the desperate relief of survival. It was not the anxious gratitude of a debtor. It was something else entirely, something softer and more profound. It was a sense of peace, a sense of place. It was the feeling of a heart, long frozen by fear and suspicion, beginning, finally, to thaw. Love, she was learning, did not always arrive with a thunderclap or a grand declaration. Sometimes it grew in the silence, as quiet and as resilient as a single wildflower in the desert. The peace of the hollow was a fragile, living thing. It was in the drone of the bees in the garden, the gentle whisper of the cottonwood leaves, the comfortable silence inside the cabin. For weeks, this peace had been Etta's medicine, slowly healing the raw wounds of her past. She had come to believe, in the foolish, hopeful part of her heart, that the canyon walls were high enough to keep the rest of the world out forever. The day Tremble returned began like any other. The morning was cool and clear, the sky a vast, empty blue. Etta and Huck were on their knees in the garden, their hands deep in the dark, rich earth. She was showing him how to tell the difference between a vegetable shoot and a weed, her voice soft in the quiet air. Huck listened with his usual solemn intensity, his small fingers carefully mimicking her own. In that moment, surrounded by the simple green life they were nurturing, Etta felt a contentment so pure and profound it was almost painful. The first sign was the horse, Will's buckskin, usually placid as it dozed in its small corral, suddenly lifted its head, its ears swiveled, then pinned back. It gave a low, nervous whicker and sidestepped, its eyes fixed on the narrow entrance to the canyon. Etta's hands froze in the dirt. She looked at the horse, then at the canyon mouth. She saw nothing but the familiar shimmer of heat on rock. But the animal's fear was a contagion. A cold dread, a familiar and sickening companion, began to uncoil in her stomach. Huck, sensing the change in her, looked up, his face a question. Before she could speak, a sound drifted down the canyon, the faint, rhythmic clink of metal on stone. It was not the sound of a deer or a coyote. It was the sound of shod horses picking their way over the rocky ground. The cabin door opened. Will stood there, wiping his hands on a rag. He hadn't been in the cabin, he'd been in the small shed behind it, mending a saddle. His eyes were not on Etta or the boy, but on the same spot the horse was staring at, his head tilted, listening. His entire body had gone rigid, a statue of pure, focused attention. The casual ease of the homesteader had vanished, replaced in an instant by the lethal stillness of the soldier. He looked at her. He didn't need to speak. His eyes, cold and gray as a storm front, said everything. It's them. He moved with a speed that belied his size. Etta, get the boy. Inside. Now! His voice was a low, urgent command, stripped of all warmth. The world seemed to slow down, every detail becoming sharp and terrifyingly clear. The buzzing of the bees sounded unnaturally loud. The sun felt cold on her skin. Her first instinct, the one that had kept her alive for so long, screamed at her. Run! Hide! Disappear! But this time, it was different. She wasn't alone. She looked at Huck's wide, frightened eyes, and a new instinct, fierce and primal, rose up to choke the old one. She grabbed his small hand. Come on, Huck, inside. She pulled him toward the cabin, her feet stumbling in the soft dirt. As they ran the short distance to the door, 3 riders emerged from the canyon mouth, their figures dark silhouettes against the bright sky. They were not moving fast. They were confident. They knew they had their prey cornered. Will met her at the door. He didn't look at the approaching men. He looked at her, his gaze intense. He pushed his Colt revolver into her hands. The gun was shockingly heavy, its cold, dense weight an alien thing in her palm. Bolt the door. Stay away from the window. Keep him down. She stared at the weapon, her mind recoiling. She had never held a gun in her life. They were the tools of men like Jedediah, men like Silas. They were things of violence and pain. I can't, she began, her voice a choked whisper. You will, he said, his voice hard as iron. He gave her a small, rough push into the cabin. Do it, Etta. Then he turned, pulling the heavy door almost closed behind him, leaving it open just a crack. He stood on the stone step, his body a solid, immovable barrier between the life he had built in the hollow and the ugliness that had come to destroy it. He held his rifle loosely in his hands, pointed at the ground. He was not a threat. Not yet. He was a statement. This far, and no further. Etta slammed the heavy wooden bolt into place, the sound a definitive crack of thunder in the small room. She grabbed Huck's shoulders and pushed him down into the corner between the hearth and the wall, the safest place she could think of. Stay here, she ordered, her voice trembling. Don't move. Do you understand? He nodded, his small body rigid with fear, his eyes fixed on the door. Etta crouched beside him, the heavy revolver clutched in her 2 hands. Her fingers were slick with sweat. Her heart was a wild bird trapped in her ribs, beating itself raw against the bone. Through the small, grimy window, she could see the 3 riders pull up about 20 yards from the cabin. It was Silas, Jeb, and the 3rd man, Finn. Calder. Silas's voice was a familiar, oily sneer that made Etta's skin crawl. We had a feeling we might find you here. That was a neat trick you pulled on the train, a real neat trick, but the show's over now. Send out the girl. Will did not answer. He stood as still as the rocks around him. Don't be a fool, Silas continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. She ain't worth it. She's stolen property, is all. We just want what's ours. Give her to us, and we'll ride out of here. No one has to get hurt. It was the oldest lie in the world. Etta knew it, and she knew Will knew it too. These men had not come all this way for a peaceful negotiation. They had come for blood. Will slowly raised the rifle until its stock rested against his shoulder. The movement was deliberate, a final, silent answer. Silas laughed, a short, ugly sound. Have it your way. Everything happened at once. Silas and Jeb swung down from their horses, taking cover behind a rocky outcropping. The 3rd man, Finn, spurred his horse in a wide circle, pulling a rifle from his saddle scabbard. The first shot was not from Will. It was from Silas. A puff of smoke erupted from the rocks, and a split second later, a chunk of wood exploded from the cabin's doorframe, just inches from where Will stood. Will didn't flinch. He fired back, a single, deafening boom that echoed through the canyon. His shot was not aimed at Silas, but at the ground in front of his horse. The animal screamed and reared, and Finn was thrown from the saddle. The world dissolved into a chaos of noise and violence. Etta pressed herself and Huck deeper into the corner as another shot ripped through the cabin wall, filling the air with a smell of splintered pine and gunpowder. Huck cried out, a small, terrified sound. Etta's world narrowed to that sound. The roar of the guns, the shouts of the men, her own frantic heartbeat, it all faded away. The only thing that mattered was the small, trembling boy beside her. She peeked over the edge of the windowsill. Will was no longer on the step. He was using the corner of the cabin as cover, exchanging shots with Silas and Jeb. Finn, the man who had been thrown from his horse, was on his feet now. He wasn't firing. He was running, crouched low, heading for the back of the cabin. He was going to try to get in from the other side. There was a window there, smaller than the one in the front, but big enough for a man to climb through. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. Will was pinned down. He couldn't see him. It was up to her. She looked down at the gun in her hands. It felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Her mind screamed at her to drop it, to hide, to do anything but use it. But then she looked at Huck, his face buried in his knees, his small body shaking. She thought of her father, walking away. She thought of Jedediah's wet, smiling eyes. All her life, she had been the one who was run down, the one who was cornered. All her life, she had done nothing but flee. Not this time. Her hands, still trembling, grew steady. Her resolve hardened into a cold, sharp point. She crawled across the floor to the back wall, dragging the heavy gun with her. She could hear him now, scrabbling at the wooden shutters outside the small window. She rose to her knees, raised the gun, and pointed it at the window. The shutter splintered and then burst inward, and a man's face, bearded and grimacing with effort, appeared in the opening. It was Finn. His eyes met hers, and for a split second, they both froze. His face registered surprise, then a cruel, contemptuous smirk. He thought she was just a terrified girl. He thought she was no threat at all. He started to climb through. Etta squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow. The gun kicked back with a brutal, shocking force, slamming her shoulder against the wall. The roar in the small cabin was deafening. Acrid smoke filled her nostrils, making her cough and choke. For a moment, she was completely disoriented. When her vision cleared, the face in the window was gone. Outside, there was a choked cry, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the ground. She had done it. Etta, had fired a gun. She had shot a man. A wave of nausea and horror washed over her, but there was no time for it. A new sound cut through the din of the gunfight, the sickening crunch of wood splintering, followed by a heavy, animalistic grunt. It came from the front of the cabin. She scrambled back to the main window just in time to see it. Jeb, the larger of the two men, had charged Will from the side. He hadn't fired his gun. He had used it as a club, swinging the heavy stock of his rifle like an axe. The blow caught Will on the side of the head with a sickening thud. Will's body went limp. He didn't make a sound. He simply crumpled, folding in on himself like a cloth doll, and fell face down in the dirt. He lay utterly still. Etta's world stopped. The air left her lungs. Her heart ceased to beat. He's dead. The thought was a white-hot knife in her brain. The fortress had fallen. The one solid, immovable point in her chaotic universe was gone. A despair so absolute, so profound, washed over her that it almost brought her to her knees. This was it. The end. Jeb stood over Will's still form, breathing heavily, a triumphant leer on his face. Silas emerged from behind the rocks, his gun still smoking. "Is he done?" Silas called. "He's done," Jeb grunted, nudging Will's body with his boot. "Never saw me coming." They started toward the cabin, their boots crunching on the gravel. They were coming for her and Huck. The old Etta, the one who had stumbled onto the train weeks ago, would have collapsed. She would have huddled in the corner and waited for the inevitable. But that Etta was gone. She had died in the deafening roar of her own gunshot. She had been burned away in the fiery, protective love she felt for the boy cowering behind her. She had been remade in the image of the man who now lay dead in the dirt because of her. Something inside her broke, but it was not her spirit. It was the last of her fear, a cold, clear rage, a feeling she had never known she possessed, filled the void where the terror had been. She looked at Will's gun, still clutched in her hand. She looked at Huck, who was now staring at her, his eyes full of a child's absolute terror. She looked at the cabin door, where the men's shadows were now falling. She was not going to run. She would not let them touch the boy. She would not let them defile this home. This was her hollow now, and she would defend it. She scrambled to the door, her movements clumsy but driven by a ferocious new purpose. With trembling hands, she lifted the heavy bolt. She took a deep, ragged breath. Then, with a cry that was part terror, part defiance, she threw the door open and stumbled out into the blinding sunlight, the heavy gun held before her, ready to face the storm. She was still shaking. She was still terrified, but she was standing, and she was no longer running. The world erupted in a spray of gravel and a panicked shout. Silas and Jeb, their faces masks of cruel confidence, froze mid-stride, their eyes widening in disbelief. They had expected to find a weeping, broken girl cowering in a corner. They had not expected this, not this wild-eyed creature. Her face streaked with dirt and tears, her knuckles white as she leveled the heavy Colt at them, its dark, unforgiving eyes staring them down. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The canyon was utterly silent, the echoes of the gunfight still ringing in the air. In that frozen moment, Silas's surprise curdled into contemptuous amusement. He let out a low, ugly chuckle. "Well, look at you," he sneered, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "The little kitten's got claws? What you gonna do with that, girl? You gonna shoot us both? You even know which end the bullet comes out of?" Etta's hands trembled so violently that the barrel of the gun wavered. Her mind was a screaming void. She had no plan. There was no thought beyond the raw, primal instinct to stand between these men and the boy in the cabin. But before Silas could take another step, a new sound split the air. It was a high, piercing scream of pure equine terror. Silas's horse, the one Will had shot near, finally broke its tether and bolted, galloping wildly back down the canyon. At the same time, from farther down the canyon mouth, came the distinct sound of another rider approaching at a steady trot. Silas and Jeb exchanged a sharp, panicked look. They had expected an isolated cabin, an easy prize. They had not expected witnesses. They had not expected complications. A dead man and a captured girl could be explained away or simply disappear. But a gunfight with other riders present was a different matter entirely. That could lead to a posse, a chase, a rope. "Damn it," Silas spat, his eyes darting from Etta to the direction of the new rider. The confidence had vanished, replaced by the furtive cunning of a cornered rat. He made a decision. "Forget her. Let's go." Jeb needed no convincing. He gave one last, hateful look at Will's still form, then turned and ran for his horse. Silas backed away, his own gun now raised, keeping it trained on Etta as he retreated. "This ain't over," he hissed, his voice a venomous promise. He swung himself into his saddle, and a moment later, he and Jeb were gone, their horses' hooves pounding a frantic retreat down the canyon, leaving a cloud of dust and a profound, ringing silence in their wake. Etta stood there, the heavy gun still raised, her body shaking uncontrollably. The approaching rider came into view, a lone prospector on a mule, his face a mask of bewildered curiosity. He slowed, took in the scene, the man lying on the ground, the dead body behind the cabin, the girl with the gun, and wisely decided to turn his mule around and ride away as fast as the creature could carry him. And then she was alone. The dust settled, the sun beat down. The only sound was the frantic, ragged rasp of her own breathing. The gun slipped from her nerveless fingers and thudded into the dirt. The strength, the rage, the ferocious defiance that had propelled her out the door, all of it drained away, leaving her hollow and trembling. Her gaze fell on Will. He lay exactly as he had fallen, a crumpled, broken shape in the harsh sunlight, a wave of grief and despair so absolute, so physically powerful, washed over her that her knees buckled. She fell to the ground, a dry, tearing sob ripping from her throat. It was over. He was gone. He had saved her, and she had gotten him killed. The silence of the hollow was no longer a comfort. It was a tomb. She crawled to him, her movements slow and leaden, as if moving through deep water. She didn't want to look, but she had to. She had to know. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his shoulder. His shirt was caked with dirt and a dark, sticky wetness. She gently, fearfully, rolled him over. His face was a mess of blood and dirt. A deep, ugly gash ran along his temple, matting his dark hair. His eyes were closed, his skin a pale, ashen color beneath the tan. He looked completely, irrevocably gone. She rested her head on his chest, her ear pressed against the still warm fabric of his shirt, and wept, her tears soaking into the dusty chambray. She lay there for a long time, lost in a gray fog of shock and sorrow, and then, beneath her ear, she felt it. It was so faint she thought she had imagined it, a slight, almost imperceptible rise and fall, a flutter. She held her breath, straining to hear, to feel, and there it was again, a shallow, ragged intake of air, followed by a long, slow release. Thump, thump. The sound was a whisper, a ghost of a beat. But it was there. His heart was still beating. He was alive. The word was a silent explosion in her mind. Hope, fierce and terrifying and exquisitely painful, shot through her. It was a physical jolt, a current that brought her back to life. He was alive. And if he was alive, she had to do something. Getting him inside was a feat of impossible will. She called for Huck, who emerged from the cabin, his face pale and tear-streaked. Together, the woman and the boy, they became a single, desperate machine. They strained and pulled, their feet slipping in the dirt. Will was a dead weight, an anchor of unconscious flesh and bone. They dragged him an inch at a time, his boots scoring 2 long furrows in the ground. It was a brutal, grueling task. By the time they got him over the threshold and onto his bunk, they were both gasping for breath, their muscles screaming in protest, their bodies slick with sweat. The storm outside had passed, but a new one, a quiet, desperate battle for life, had begun within the 4 walls of the cabin. The days that followed blurred into a single, continuous twilight of fear and exhaustion. Time lost its meaning, marked only by the changing quality of the light through the window and the rhythm of Will's shallow breathing. Etta moved as if in a dream, her world shrinking to the small, suffocating space around his bunk. She cleaned the wound on his head as best she could, her stomach churning at the sight. She tore strips from her own petticoat to make fresh bandages. She bathed his face with cool water, her touch a clumsy but tender prayer. She learned the sound of his breathing so intimately that she could tell when it grew shallower, when it hitched, when it seemed to be fading away entirely. In those moments, a cold terror would grip her, and she would press her ear to his chest, waiting, praying for the faint, reassuring beat of his heart. Food became an afterthought. She brewed bitter teas from the roots she had gathered, forcing a few spoonfuls of the warm liquid between his lips, watching with desperate hope to see if his throat would work, if he would swallow. She made thin broths from the last of their dried vegetables, the scent filling the cabin with a mockery of warmth and nourishment. She ate only when she felt she was about to collapse, small, tasteless bites of hardtack and jerky. Huck was her silent, shadow-like partner in the vigil. He seemed to have aged a decade in a single afternoon. The boyish curiosity in his eyes had been replaced by a man's solemn gravity. He kept the fire going, his small hands expertly adding logs to keep the cabin from growing cold in the night. He fetched water from the well, his small shoulders straining under the weight of the bucket. He did these things without being asked, moving with a quiet efficiency that mirrored Will's own. When his chores were done, he would sit on the floor by Will's bunk. He had found a piece of charcoal from the fire and a stack of smooth, flat pieces of kindling, and for hours he would draw. He drew the cabin, its chimney smoking. He drew Will's horse, standing in its corral. He drew Etta, a tall, stick-like figure with wild hair, standing in the garden. and over, he drew a family, a big man, a small boy, and a woman, all holding hands under a smiling, childlike sun. The small, scratching sound of his charcoal on wood was the only art in the grim, silent room, a testament of faith in a world that had been shattered. One night, Etta sat in the chair by the bunk, her head slumped forward, having finally succumbed to a bone-deep exhaustion. The oil lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Will's breathing was particularly shallow, and a low-grade fever had made his skin hot and dry to the touch. She had done everything she knew how to do, and it wasn't enough. He was slipping away from her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Despair was a cold, heavy blanket, and she was too tired to fight it any longer. She was woken by a touch. It was not a dream. A hand, weak and trembling, was on her arm, her head snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. Will's eyes were open. They were not the clear, pale gray she knew. They were clouded with pain and confusion, unfocused. They stared blankly at the log ceiling above him. Etta's breath caught. She didn't dare move, didn't dare hope. His gaze drifted slowly, listlessly. Around the room, he seemed to be trying to make sense of where he was. Then, his eyes found her. For a long moment, they just looked at her, empty and unrecognizing. She could see him struggling, fighting his way back from some deep, dark place. And then, a flicker, a spark of light in the fog. His brow furrowed slightly, his lips parted, but no sound came out. His eyes cleared, and he saw her. He knew her. Tears welled in Etta's eyes, blurring his face into a watery mirage. She had been so afraid she would never see that recognition in his eyes again. His gaze was filled with 1,000 questions, but he was too weak to ask them. He looked at the bandage on his head, then back at her, and a dawning understanding filled his eyes. He knew he was hurt. He knew she had been the one to care for him. With an effort that seemed to drain every last ounce of his strength, he lifted his hand from her arm. She thought he was letting go, but instead, he turned it palm up, an invitation. Her own hand, small and trembling, slid into his. His fingers were hot and dry from the fever, but they closed around hers. The grip was incredibly weak, a mere ghost of his usual strength. It was the frail touch of a sick man, but in that fragile connection, a world of unspoken things was communicated. It was gratitude. It was acknowledgement. It was a recognition of the battles she had fought for him, for them. In the silence, it was a single, powerful statement. I am here. You are here. We are still here. She squeezed his hand in return, the tears now falling freely, silently down her cheeks. She did not need words. He did not need words. In the quiet stillness of the lamplit cabin, with the boy's innocent drawings scattered on the floor and the scent of wood smoke and herbs in the air, a profound and unshakable truth had settled. Their bond had been forged in the chaos of a moving train, tested by the telling of a painful past, and now it had been sealed in the crucible of violence and the quiet desperation of this vigil. They were no longer a man, a woman, and a boy. They were a family. And in the silent, certain grip of his hand, Etta knew, with a certainty that reached into the very core of her soul, that she was finally, truly home. The silence that followed the storm was a different entity from the one that had preceded it. It was not the peaceful, foundational quiet of the hollow. It was a stillness born of shock, a vacuum where the roar of violence had been. For days, this new silence was all-consuming, broken only by the shallow, ragged rhythm of Will's breathing and the soft scratch of Huck's charcoal on wood. But with the first flicker of recognition in Will's eyes, the first weak pressure of his hand on hers, the nature of the silence began to change again. It became a space for healing. His recovery was a slow, arduous journey measured in excruciatingly small victories. The first time he managed to swallow a spoonful of broth without choking. The first time his eyes could follow her as she moved across the room. The first time his fingers had enough strength to grip the tin cup she held to his lips. Etta was the architect of this recovery, her life a constant, revolving cycle of changing his bandages, cooling his fevered skin, and coaxing nourishment into his weakened body. She moved with a purpose that left no room for the ghosts of her past. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface of her thoughts, but it was no longer her master. It had been relegated to the back room of her mind, subordinate to the all-consuming, immediate needs of the man in the bunk. One afternoon, a week after the attack, Will spoke for the first time. His voice was a dry, cracking whisper, a faint echo of its former strength. "The man," he rasped, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Behind the house." Etta, who was stirring a pot over the fire, froze. She had tried not to think about it, about the heavy, still form she and Huck had dragged into a shallow grave at the far end of the canyon. "He's gone," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "It's taken care of." He closed his eyes, a flicker of something relief. Understanding passing over his face, he asked no more questions. He didn't ask how or why. He didn't ask about the gun. He simply accepted her words. A silent acknowledgement of the truth that now lay between them. She had crossed a line for him. For them. She had stepped out of the role of the protected and had become a protector. It was in the days that followed this brief exchange that the realization began to crystallize within her. It came to her, not in a flash, but as a slow, dawning light. She was standing outside, shaking a dusty blanket in the crisp morning air. When her eyes fell on the front of the cabin, it was scarred. The door frame was a splintered ruin. A dark, ugly hole marked the spot where a bullet had punched through the log wall. It was a physical testament to the violation, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. The old Etta would have seen those scars and felt only fear. She would have seen them as proof that no place was safe, that trouble would always find her. She would have felt the familiar, frantic urge to run, to find a deeper hiding place, a more remote sanctuary. But as she stood there, the blanket still in her hands, she felt something entirely new. She felt a quiet, stubborn anger, a sense of indignation. This was her home. That bullet hole was a wound in the flesh of her life, and it needed to be mended. The thought was so simple, so clear, that it startled her. She was not thinking of fleeing. She was thinking of rebuilding. She remembered the moment with a chilling, dreamlike clarity. Jeb's rifle butt swinging through the air, the sickening thud, Will crumpling to the ground, a fallen giant. In that instant, her world had ended. The shield was gone. The fortress had been breached. And in the black, terrifying void that followed, she had been faced with the same choice that had defined her entire existence: run or be destroyed. But she hadn't run. She had unlocked the door and stepped out into the light. The memory was a physical sensation, the shocking weight of the gun, the blinding sun in her eyes, the raw, tearing cry that had been ripped from her throat. For her entire life, to stand still had been to be caught, to be trapped. But in that moment, standing still had been the only form of movement that mattered. It had been an act of defiance. She had been terrified. The fear had been a cold, metallic taste in her mouth, a fire in her veins. But something else had been stronger. The image of Huck, his small face buried in his knees, the memory of Will's silent acceptance, of the flower pressed between the pages of his book. Love, she realized, was not the gentle feeling she had read about in the tattered novels that sometimes passed through towns. It was not a reward that came after the danger had passed. It was a weapon. It was the thing that grew in the heart of the chaos, the thing that gave you the strength to face the storm, even when you were shaking so hard you thought you might fall apart. She had stood her ground not because she had suddenly become brave, but because the thought of losing this life, this man, this boy, was more terrifying than any bullet. The choice had not been between fighting and fleeing. It had been between this life and no life at all. This realization settled into her bones, not as a thought, but as a deep, foundational truth. She was no longer a piece of driftwood, tossed about by the currents of other people's greed and violence. She was a tree, and she had put down roots in this rocky, unforgiving soil. She dropped the blanket and walked to the woodshed. She found a hammer and a handful of nails. She found a spare board. Her movements were clumsy at first, but she was driven by a new and powerful sense of purpose. She began to patch the hole in the wall. The work was hard. The wood was thick, the nails bent under her inexpert blows. But with each strike of the hammer, she was not just mending a wall. She was reclaiming her home. She was driving a nail into the coffin of the girl who ran. Huck came to watch her, his head cocked to one side. A few days later, Will, leaning heavily on a carved stick, emerged from the cabin for the first time. He stood in the sunlight, his face pale and drawn, and watched her work. He didn't offer to help, he was still too weak. He didn't offer advice. He simply stood there, a silent, approving presence, and let her build. The days of healing became days of rebuilding. The quiet, desperate vigil inside the cabin transformed into a shared, purposeful labor outside of it. Their life became a series of small, significant acts of restoration. Will, as his strength returned, took on the heavier tasks. He began by repairing the splintered door frame, his movements slow and careful. Etta would bring him his tools. Huck would sit nearby, picking up the fallen wood shavings. They worked in a comfortable, collaborative silence, a team bound by a shared purpose. The sound of his saw and hammer became the new rhythm of their lives, a steady, constructive beat that pushed back against the memory of the gunshots. Together, they rebuilt the section of the corral fence that had been broken when the horse had bolted. Etta held the posts steady while Will, his movements still stiff, dug the holes and tamped the earth down around them. The physical act of defining their space, of reestablishing the boundary between their home and the wild world outside, was a powerful affirmation. They were not just repairing a fence, they were declaring, in the silent language of wood and sweat, that this was their ground. They would hold it. The daily chores, once performed in a quiet, solitary routine, became shared tasks. Etta would be kneading dough for bread, and Will, sitting at the table to rest, would begin shelling beans, his fingers working slowly but steadily. They would work side by side in the garden, she pulling weeds, he carefully staking the tomato plants that had survived the neglect. They moved around each other with an unspoken understanding, an easy, fluid grace that had been born of crisis and convalescence. One afternoon, Etta found Will standing by the shallow grave at the edge of the canyon. He had placed a large, flat stone over it, a simple, unmarked monument. He stood there for a long time, his back to her, and she knew he was thinking about the violence that had come to their door, about the man he had killed, about the man she had shot. When he finally turned, his face was grim, but it was not haunted. It was the face of a man who had accepted the harsh necessities of the world he lived in. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not only an acknowledgement of the ugliness they had faced, but a deep, abiding respect for the way she had faced it with him. Each day was an affirmation. The shared meal at the end of a long day of work was an affirmation. The way Huck would now lean against Will's leg as he read from one of his books in the evening was an affirmation. The sight of the patched wall, the new door frame, the sturdy fence, it was all proof of something that had been built not in peace, but in the very heart of chaos. It was a testament to the fact that they were survivors, and that they had survived together. One evening, they sat on the stone step, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. Huck was asleep inside. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply watched as the first stars began to appear in the deep velvet of the sky. "You saved my life, Etta," Will said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Etta looked at her own hands, resting in her lap. They were no longer the hands of a frightened girl. They were red and calloused from the lye soap and the rough wood of the hammer. They were stained with dirt from the garden. They were strong. They were the hands of a woman who had held a gun, tended a wound, and rebuilt a home. "We saved each other," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He turned his head and looked at her. The firelight from the cabin door flickered across his face, softening the hard lines, warming the cool gray of his eyes. He reached out and took her hand. His own was still rough and scarred, but the strength had returned to it. His grip was warm, solid, and sure. It was not the grip of a man pulling a girl from a train. It was not the weak, feverish touch of a patient. It was the hand of a partner. In that simple, silent touch, the affirmation was complete. She was not the girl hiding under his coat. She was the woman sitting beside him. They were not two broken people hiding from the world. They were two people who had faced the world and found, in each other, the strength to build a life in its wake. The weeks that followed settled into a quiet rhythm of healing and rebuilding, a peaceful cadence that Etta had come to cherish more than she had ever thought possible. The physical scars on the cabin were mended, the deeper scars on their lives slowly beginning to fade under the steady balm of shared work and silent companionship. The canyon had become more than a sanctuary. It was a world, entire and complete, a place where the ghosts of the past seemed to hold no power. One night, the wind rose. It was a different wind from the gentle breezes that usually whispered through the cottonwoods. This was a wild, lonely wind, a harbinger of the changing seasons. It swept down from the high plains, howling at the mouth of the canyon, rattling the wooden shutters, and probing the mud chinking of the cabin walls with invisible, insistent fingers. Inside, the fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter, its flames leaping and dancing as if in answer to the turmoil outside. Huck had been asleep for hours, a small, still shape in his bunk, lost to the world. Will sat in the chair by the hearth, not mending or cleaning anything for once. He was simply watching the fire, his hands resting on his knees, his face cast in a familiar, unreadable mask of flickering gold and deep shadow. The wind moaned in the chimney, a low, mournful song that seemed to pull at something deep inside Etta. She stood by the table, having just finished tidying away the last of their supper. She was acutely aware of the small, enclosed space, of the howling wilderness outside, and of the profound, unbreachable stillness of the man by the fire. He was a mountain, a bulwark against the storm. He was the reason she was safe, the reason she was whole. A feeling she could not name, a deep, powerful current of emotion, began to build within her. It was a feeling born of gratitude, of respect, of a tenderness so fierce it ached in her chest. It was the culmination of every silent gesture, the pressed flower, the cup of cool water, the steady, unwavering look in his eyes when he had woken from the darkness. She had given him her story, and he had given her a home. He had seen the ugliest, most broken parts of her, and he had not flinched. And now, in the heart of this wild night, she felt an overwhelming need to offer him the only thing she had left that was truly, completely her own. Her heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat against the howling of the wind. Her hands felt cold, her breath shallow. This was not a decision born of thought, but an instinct that rose from the deepest, most newly awakened part of her soul. This was not about paying a debt. It was not about surrender. It was about choice. It was about meeting his stillness with a terrifying, vulnerable motion of her own. She took a step away from the table, into the center of the small room. He did not seem to notice, his gaze still fixed on the flames, but she knew he was aware of her every breath, her every heartbeat. He was always aware. Her hands rose, and they were trembling. She could feel the tremor starting in her fingertips and traveling up her arms. She willed them to be still, but they would not obey. They were traitors, broadcasting the fear and the hope that were warring within her. She brought her hands to the collar of her simple calico dress. Her fingers fumbled as they found the first button, a small, smooth disc of polished bone. The sound of her own breathing was a roar in her ears, louder than the wind. For a moment, she faltered. The ghosts of the past were not gone after all. They were right there, whispering in the shadows, their voices full of mockery and contempt. You are nothing. You are property. This is all you are good for. She looked at Will. He had turned his head slightly, his gaze shifting from the fire to her. He watched her, his expression unchanged, but his eyes were dark and deep and utterly focused. He saw her. He saw the trembling of her hands. He saw the battle being waged on her face. And in his gaze, there was no judgment. There was only a profound, patient stillness. He was waiting. He was letting her choose. His quiet attention was the anchor she needed. She took a deep, shuddering breath, and the ghosts receded. This was not for them. This was not for her father, or for Jedediah, or for any of the men whose hands had made her feel like a thing. This was for the man who had never asked for anything. This was for herself. Her fingers closed around the first button. She worked it free from its hole. The fabric parted, revealing a small triangle of skin at the base of her throat. She moved to the second button, then the third. Each small act was a monumental effort, a defiance of a lifetime of fear. Her voice, when she spoke, was a whisper, so fragile it seemed the wind might snatch it away. "I've never," she began, her voice catching. She swallowed and tried again, her eyes locked on his. "I've never undressed for anyone." She paused, the weight of that truth hanging in the warm, firelit air between them. Then she added the words that changed everything, the words that reclaimed her past and defined her present. "Not because I was forced to." She had laid her soul bare. It was not an invitation, not a seduction. It was a confession. It was a declaration of freedom. She was telling him that this act, this terrifying, vulnerable act, was the first one of its kind in her entire life that belonged to her. Will's face remained a mask of quiet contemplation. The firelight carved deep shadows under his cheekbones, making him look ancient and solemn. He did not smile. He did not move toward her. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her hands, which were still fumbling with the fourth button of her dress. He watched the tremor, the sheer, painful effort of her will fighting against the instinct of her fear. He watched for a long, silent moment, his stillness a form of witness, a silent acknowledgement of the enormous gravity of what she was doing. She managed to undo one more button. The dress now hung open to the middle of her chest. She could feel the warm air from the fire on her skin, a shocking, intimate sensation. And then, her courage failed her. Her hands, as if they had a will of their own, fell away from the dress. They dropped to her sides, empty and trembling. She could go no further. She had brought herself to the edge of the cliff and could not take the final step. She stood before him, undone and exposed, her eyes wide and vulnerable, waiting for his verdict. The silence in the cabin stretched thin, pulled taut between the howl of the wind outside and the frantic beating of her heart inside. This was the moment he would rise and cross the room and claim what she had offered, the moment he would take her, and she would finally know what it was to be with a man by choice. He moved, but not in the way she expected. He did not rise with a look of desire. He did not smile a victor's smile. He simply pushed himself to his feet. The scrape of the chair's legs on the stone floor a loud, definitive sound. He walked toward her, his step slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He was a mountain of a man, and she had never felt so small, so fragile. She braced herself, her eyes closing for a brief, involuntary second. But he did not touch her skin. He reached past her, to the simple woolen shawl that was draped over the back of her chair. He picked it up. The wool was rough and smelled faintly of wood smoke. And then, with a movement of infinite, surprising gentleness. He draped it over her shoulders, pulling the two ends together in the front, covering the exposed skin, shielding her from the fire's warmth and the intensity of his own gaze. His knuckles brushed against her collarbone as he adjusted the shawl, a touch so light it was like the whisper of a moth's wing. It was the first time he had ever touched her with such deliberate tenderness, and the shock of it was more profound than any passionate embrace could ever have been. She opened her eyes and looked up at him, her mind a swirl of confusion and a dawning, wondrous understanding. He looked down at her, and, for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that was not stillness or watchfulness or quiet respect. It was a deep, aching tenderness, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. "The first time," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur, barely audible over the wind. "It has to be a choice, made in the quiet, with no ghosts in the room." He paused, his gaze holding hers, making sure she understood. "And the next time," he continued, his voice even softer, "if there is one, the same." He let his hands fall away. He did not kiss her. He did not embrace her. He simply stood before her for a moment longer, his presence a shield, his words a gift more precious than any physical act could ever have been. He had seen her offering the most vulnerable, precious offering she could make, and instead of taking it, he had protected it. He had honored her choice by giving it back to her, to be made again, in her own time, on her own terms. He turned and walked back to his chair by the fire, leaving her standing in the middle of the room, clutching the warm wool of the shawl. The wind still howled outside, but the storm inside her had passed. The ghosts were silent. She was not rejected. She was not denied. She was respected. She was cherished. She was safe. And in that moment, Etta understood that love was not about taking. It was about the profound, unshakable courage it took to protect another's fragile, hard-won freedom. The wind died with the darkness, leaving a world washed clean and utterly still. Etta woke to a different kind of silence. It was not the tense, listening quiet of the vigil, nor the hollow emptiness that had followed the gunfight. This was a deep, resonant peace, the sound of a world breathing in after a long exhalation. The morning light that filtered through the window was pale and soft, touching the rough log walls with a gentle, forgiving hand. She lay in her bunk for a long time, not moving, simply existing in the quiet. The memory of the night before was not a source of shame or confusion. It was a solid, warm presence inside her. She could still feel the phantom weight of the shawl on her shoulders, the brief, feather-light brush of his knuckles against her skin. He had not taken what she offered. He had sheltered it. He had seen her most vulnerable, desperate attempt to connect, and had met it not with passion, but with a form of grace so profound it had fundamentally rearranged the landscape of her soul. He had given her a gift greater than safety, greater than shelter. He had given her back her own choice. Slowly, she rose. Her movements were different. The tentative, bird-like caution was gone, replaced by a new, quiet deliberation. She dressed, her fingers buttoning her dress not with trembling fear, but with a simple, practical efficiency. She looked at her reflection in the murky glass of the window pane, a woman's face, no longer a girl's, etched with the stories of the last few months, but with a new stillness in the eyes, a steadiness that had not been there before. She slid the bolt on the cabin door and stepped outside. The air was cool and sharp and smelled of rain-washed dust and damp pine. The sky was a pale, clean blue, swept clear of clouds, the violence of the previous day. The ugliness of the attack seemed like a bad dream, a story that had happened in another lifetime. The scars were still there, the patched wall, the new wood of the door frame, but they no longer looked like wounds. They looked like healed-over proof of survival. Her gaze swept across the small, familiar world of the hollow, and then she heard it, a sound of such pure, uncomplicated joy that it made her heart ache. It was Huck's laughter, a bright, pealing sound that seemed to fill the entire canyon. She saw him near the corral. He was sitting astride the old, placid mule they used for hauling wood, his small legs sticking straight out, his face alight with a beatific grin. He wasn't going anywhere. He was simply enjoying the feeling of being high off the ground, the master of his own small, gentle beast. And then she saw Will. He was at the far end of the garden, working on the section of fence that had been damaged. He had his back to her. He was stripped to his shirt sleeves, the muscles in his back and shoulders moving with a steady, powerful rhythm as he worked. He was setting a new post, his movements economical and certain. He was not a soldier standing guard or a silent, watchful protector. He was a man tending his home, his movements a quiet testament to the future, to the belief that there would be a tomorrow worth securing. He was the anchor of this peaceful world, the source of its strength. Etta stood on the stone step and simply watched them for a long time. The boy's innocent laughter, the man's steady work, the clean morning light. This was it. This was the life that had been forged in the fire. It wasn't a grand or an easy life. It was a life of hard work and constant vigilance, a life lived on the edge of a harsh and unforgiving world. But it was real, and it was hers. She began to walk toward him. Her feet, in their sturdy, worn boots, made a soft, crunching sound on the gravelly path. This was a different journey from the one she had made stumbling onto the train, or the one she had taken on his back through the desert. Her steps were not frantic, not desperate. They were even and sure. She was not going to him for rescue or for permission. She was not going to him to ask for anything. She was simply going to him. He must have heard her approach. He finished tamping the earth around the base of the post with his boot, then slowly turned. He wiped a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm and watched her come. His face was calm, his expression revealing nothing, but his eyes, as they met hers across the 20 yards that separated them, were full of a quiet, waiting light. He did not speak. He did not smile. He simply stood and waited for her to close the distance. She stopped when she reached the fence line, the half-mended boundary between the garden and the wilderness. A small stack of new fence rails, planed and smoothed, lay on the ground. A hammer rested on top of a post. The air between them was still and charged, full of the unspoken words of the night before. But there was no awkwardness, no tension. There was only a deep, abiding sense of rightness. She looked at the work he was doing. She saw the next post that needed to be set, the rails that needed to be nailed into place. She saw the labor that was required to make this place whole. And without a word, without a moment's hesitation, she bent down. Her hands, which had once trembled as they clutched a cloth sack, were now steady as they closed around the rough, solid wood of a fence rail. It was heavy, but it was a good weight, a real weight. She lifted it, her muscles straining slightly, and held it in position against the posts, ready for it to be secured. It was a simple act. It was the movement of a homesteader, a worker, a partner, but it was also a declaration. It was the answer to every unspoken question. It was a choice, made in the bright, clear light of day. Will watched her, his gaze taking in the solid set of her shoulders, the determined line of her jaw. He saw not the frightened girl who had begged to hide under his coat, not the vulnerable woman who had offered herself in the firelight, but the strong, resilient woman who now stood before him, holding up her end of the world. A slow, almost imperceptible change occurred on his face. The hard, stoic lines around his mouth softened. A deep, quiet light of understanding, of profound and absolute acceptance, dawned in his eyes. He did not speak. Words were not needed. Words were for the world outside the canyon. In here, they had a different language. He reached out and took the hammer from the post where it rested. He did not use it himself. Instead, he held it out to her, handle first. It was not a command. It was not a request. It was an offering, a transfer. It was a gesture that said everything. This is yours too. This work, this home, this life. We build it together." Etta looked from the hammer to his face. She let go of the rail with one hand and took it. The wooden handle was warm from the sun, worn smooth from his grip. It felt solid and right in her own. Her fingers closed around it, and in that moment, the final, invisible wall between them crumbled to dust. She was no longer the refugee seeking shelter under his coat. She was the woman standing beside him, a hammer in her hand, her eyes fixed on the horizon they would face together. She was not his ward, not his responsibility, not his rescue. She was his partner. Fear had brought her to him, but it was choice. 100 small, silent choices made every day. That would keep her there. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that a life built on choice was a fortress far stronger than any coat, a sanctuary more enduring than any hidden canyon. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you are listening from, so please share your city or country in the comments below to connect with fellow fans. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850 give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people. Your support means the world to us.